An ex-wife lashes out at a family dinner, convinced her former husband abandoned her. But hours later, in a cold hospital hallway, she learns the shocking truth. The man she cursed has been secretly paying for her mother's medical bills all along. If he wasn't the villain she imagined, then who is he really? And when his health suddenly collapses, will she find the courage to uncover the whole truth before it's too late? Eleanor stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, adjusting her navy cardigan for the 10th time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed down her silver hair. The thought of seeing Frank again made her stomach churn, but she couldn't miss her daughter's birthday dinner. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "It's just a couple of hours," she muttered to herself, grabbing her purse from the bed. "You can do this, Eleanor." The drive to Giuseppe's Italian restaurant took exactly 12 minutes, but tonight it felt like an eternity. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. The familiar red and green awning came into view, and she spotted Frank's old pickup truck already in the parking lot. Of course, he'd be early. He always was. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd. The smell of garlic bread and marinara sauce filled the air as waiters bustled between tables. Eleanor heard her daughter's laugh before she saw her, coming from the private room in the back. "Mom!" her daughter called out, rising from her seat to give Eleanor a warm hug. "I'm so glad you made it." Eleanor hugged back, trying to ignore Frank's presence at the far end of the long table. He was wearing that worn brown jacket she used to hate, the one he refused to replace even when they could afford better. Some things never changed. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," Eleanor said, handing over a carefully wrapped package. She took the empty seat between her daughter and her sister-in-law, grateful for the distance from Frank. The waiter came by with bread baskets and took their drink orders. Eleanor asked for white wine, needing something to calm her nerves. As conversations flowed around her, she couldn't help stealing glances at Frank. He was talking quietly with their son-in-law about something, probably some home repair project. That's all Frank ever talked about, fixing things. Except their marriage, she thought bitterly. "So, Mom," her daughter said, touching Eleanor's arm gently, "how's the new job going?" Eleanor forced a smile. "Oh, you know how it is at the library. Quiet days. Just how I like it." She didn't mention that she'd taken the part-time position because her savings were running low. That would only lead to questions she didn't want to answer. "Dad mentioned he might be able to help you with that leaky roof," her daughter added carefully. Eleanor's jaw clenched. "I don't need his help," she said, louder than intended. A few heads turned their way. "I mean, I've already called someone about it." Her daughter's face fell slightly. "He just wants to help, Mom. You know he's good with that stuff." "Good with everything except being a husband," Eleanor muttered under her breath. The main courses arrived, momentarily distracting everyone. Eleanor picked at her chicken parmesan, her appetite diminishing with each minute. Across the table, someone mentioned college tuition costs, and Eleanor couldn't help herself. "Well, some of us had to struggle to put kids through school alone," she said, her voice carrying across the table, while others just disappeared when things got tough. Frank looked up from his plate, his face carefully neutral. "Eleanor, this isn't the time." "When is the time, Frank?" The wine had loosened her tongue. "When do we talk about how you left us hanging?" "Mom, please," their daughter whispered. "Not today." But Eleanor was like a pot finally boiling over. Years of resentment bubbled to the surface. "Do you know what it's like to count every penny? To lie awake at night, wondering how you'll make ends meet?" Frank set down his fork. "I never stopped supporting our family." "Support?" Eleanor laughed harshly. "Those measly checks barely covered groceries. While you were off doing whatever you pleased, I was working 2 jobs." The other dinner guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone coughed. A waiter approached with dessert menus but quickly retreated, sensing the tension. "Eleanor," Frank said quietly, "you don't know everything about—" "Oh, I know enough." Eleanor's voice rose sharply. "I know you abandoned us. I know you chose to walk away. I know." She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. The words burst out of her like a missile. "I wish your dad was dead." The silence that followed was deafening. Forks clattered onto plates. Someone gasped. Eleanor's daughter covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Frank looked at Eleanor for a long moment, his face a mask of quiet pain. Then, without a word, he pushed back his chair and walked out of the room. The only sound was the distant clinking of dishes and murmured conversations from other diners, oblivious to the family tragedy that had just unfolded in the private room. Eleanor remained standing, her hands trembling, as the weight of what she'd just said crashed over her like a wave. Eleanor's hands shook as she fumbled with her house keys. The evening had been ruined, and the bitter taste of her own words still lingered in her mouth. Her daughter's tear-stained face haunted her as she pushed open the front door, wanting nothing more than to sink into her armchair and forget this horrible night. The phone rang, piercing the silence. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat when she saw her mother's number flash on the caller ID. "Mom?" she answered. Heavy breathing came through the line. "Eleanor, I can't breathe right." Her mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, what's wrong?" Eleanor gripped the phone tighter, her earlier anger instantly replaced by fear. "My chest hurts so much." The words came out in gasps. "I'm coming right now. Hold on." Eleanor grabbed her car keys, nearly dropping them in her panic. She ran to her car, her sensible heels clicking against the pavement. The drive to her mother's house, usually a peaceful 10-minute journey through familiar streets, felt endless. She found her mother slumped in her favorite recliner, face pale and clammy. The sight of her usually strong parent looking so fragile made Eleanor's heart constrict. "Mom, I'm here." Eleanor knelt beside the chair, taking her mother's cold hand. "We need to get you to the hospital." Her mother nodded weakly, too breathless to speak. Eleanor helped her up, supporting most of her weight. Together they made their slow way to the car, each step careful and measured. The emergency room lights were harsh and unforgiving as Eleanor guided her mother through the sliding doors. "Please, my mother's having chest pains," she called out to the nearest nurse, who quickly brought over a wheelchair. Everything moved in a blur after that. Forms to fill out, questions to answer. Her mother disappeared behind swinging doors while Eleanor paced the waiting room, wringing her hands. Hours crawled by. The TV mounted in the corner droned on, showing infomercials nobody watched. Other worried families came and went. Eleanor's legs ached from pacing, but she couldn't sit still. Finally, a doctor emerged, his scrubs wrinkled, but his manner calm. "Mrs. Wilson?" he called out. Eleanor rushed over. "Yes? How's my mother?" "She's stable now," the doctor assured her. "It was a mild heart attack, but we caught it in time. We'll need to keep her for observation and run some tests, but the prognosis is good." Relief flooded through Eleanor's body, making her knees weak. She steadied herself against the wall. "Thank you, doctor. When can I see her?" "She's resting now, but you can visit briefly. We'll be moving her to a private room shortly." He consulted his clipboard. "The cardiac care unit is excellent, and everything's already arranged. Mr. Frank Thompson has been covering all your mother's medical expenses." Eleanor blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" The doctor looked up, confused by her reaction. "The billing's all set up through Mr. Thompson. He's been handling your mother's medical care for the past few years. Did you not know?" Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Frank? Her Frank? The same man she'd wished dead just hours ago had been quietly paying her mother's medical bills? She slumped against the wall, her mind spinning. "Are you all right, Mrs. Wilson?" The doctor reached out to steady her. Yes." Eleanor shook her head, trying to clear it. "I just didn't realize." "Well, it's all taken care of," the doctor said cheerfully, misreading her shock. "Your mother's in good hands. Room 312 when you're ready to see her." He strode off, leaving Eleanor alone in the sterile hospital corridor. She stood there, frozen, as nurses and patients moved around her like a river flowing past a stone. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her earlier words at the restaurant echoed in her head, "I wish your dad was dead." And all this time, Frank had been helping her mother, helping her family, without saying a word, without asking for credit or thanks. While she'd been cursing his name, he'd been quietly supporting the people she loved most. Eleanor pressed a hand against the cold hospital wall, steadying herself as the weight of this revelation settled over her. For the first time in years, she found herself completely and utterly speechless. The fluorescent lights of the hospital billing office cast harsh shadows across Eleanor's tired face. She had been sitting in the same plastic chair for 20 minutes, waiting to sort out her mother's medical expenses. Her legs felt wooden, and her mind kept drifting back to the restaurant, to those terrible words she had hurled at Frank. The billing clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled into a neat bun, finally called her forward. "Mrs. Thompson, I can help you over here." Eleanor gathered her purse and approached the desk. "Yes, I'm Eleanor Thompson. I'm here about my mother, Margaret Wilson. She was just admitted with chest pains, and I need to arrange payment for her care." The clerk typed quickly on her keyboard, the soft clicking filling the quiet office. "Let me pull up her file." She adjusted her reading glasses and studied the screen. "Oh yes, Mrs. Wilson. I see here that all her medical expenses have already been covered." Eleanor blinked in confusion. "That can't be right. She's only just been admitted." "No, ma'am," the clerk said, turning the monitor slightly so Eleanor could see. "According to our records, Mr. Frank Thompson set up a prepaid account for your mother's medical care 6 months ago. It's quite substantial, enough to cover any major procedures she might need." Eleanor's throat went dry. "Frank? My ex-husband?" "Yes, that's correct." The clerk scrolled through the records. "He's been making regular deposits since January. There's also a note here that he specifically requested to remain anonymous to Mrs. Wilson." Eleanor sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The same Frank she had wished dead just hours ago had been quietly taking care of her mother all this time. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her temples. "Are you all right, Mrs. Thompson?" The clerk leaned forward, concern etched on her face. I just need to verify something," Eleanor said, her voice barely steady. "How much exactly has he contributed?" The clerk typed again, then said softly, "The account currently holds just over $45,000. The number hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Frank, who lived in that modest little house and drove that old pickup truck, had set aside such a large sum for her mother's care. Her mother, who wasn't even his responsibility anymore. "Would you like a printout of the account details?" the clerk offered. Eleanor nodded numbly, watching as the printer hummed to life. The paper felt heavy in her hands as she read through the dates and amounts. Each line represented a deposit Frank had made, regular as clockwork, without breathing a word to anyone. She wandered out of the billing office in a daze, clutching the printout like a lifeline. The bustling hospital corridor seemed distant, as if she were watching it through fog. Her feet carried her automatically to the cafeteria, where she found an empty table in the corner. The harsh overhead lights buzzed as Eleanor spread the paper on the table, reading through it again and again. Her mother's doctor had mentioned expensive treatments, specialists, and medications, and Frank had somehow known to prepare for all of it. Her own words from dinner echoed in her head. "I wish your dad was dead." The memory made her stomach lurch. How many times had she complained about Frank to anyone who would listen? How often had she painted him as selfish, uncaring, while all along he had been quietly supporting her family? She remembered the way Frank had simply stood up and left the restaurant after her outburst. No anger, no defense, just that same quiet dignity he always carried. Had he gone home to his empty house, knowing all along how he'd been helping her mother? How many other secrets like this was he keeping? The guilt rose in her throat like bile. She had been so sure of her righteousness, so comfortable in her anger. Now that certainty was crumbling, leaving her with nothing but questions and shame. A coffee cup sat untouched in front of her, growing cold as she stared at the numbers on the page. Each figure seemed to mock her previous certainties about Frank's character. The man she had divorced, the man she had cursed and criticized, had been silently watching over her family all along. Eleanor pulled her phone from her purse, scrolling through old text messages she'd sent to friends, full of bitter complaints about Frank. Each one now felt like a fresh wound, a testament to how wrong she had been. She had built her whole identity around being the wronged ex-wife, and now that narrative was falling apart. The cafeteria's fluorescent lights continued their relentless buzz as Eleanor sat there, lost in her thoughts. Hospital staff came and went, their conversations a distant murmur. She barely noticed when tears began to fall, spotting the paper in front of her. How could she face her children after this? How could she explain to them that their father, whom she had maligned for years, had been their silent guardian all along? The weight of her mistakes pressed down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. She thought of her mother, lying in a hospital bed upstairs, never knowing that Frank had been watching over her all this time. Had he visited her? Had he checked on her without anyone knowing? How many other kindnesses had he performed in secret while Eleanor had been busy nursing her grievances? The coffee had grown completely cold now, untouched and forgotten. Eleanor's hands trembled as she folded the paper and tucked it into her purse. The evidence of Frank's generosity felt like both a treasure and a burden, proof of his goodness and her own blindness. Her cruel words from dinner played again in her mind, an endless loop of shame. "I wish your dad was dead." The memory of Frank's quiet exit, of her daughter's shocked face, of the stunned silence that followed, it all came rushing back with new clarity. She had been so wrong, so terribly, horribly wrong. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of her daughter's suburban home as Eleanor sat at the breakfast nook, her coffee growing cold. Sarah, her daughter, moved around the kitchen, putting away dishes, the clinking of ceramic filling the uncomfortable silence between them. "I don't know how to ask this," Eleanor finally said, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "But did you know about your father helping with Grandma's medical bills?" Sarah's hands stilled on the plate she was drying. She kept her back turned, but Eleanor could see the tension in her shoulders. "Mom, She paused, setting the plate down carefully. "I had suspicions." "Suspicions?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "What do you mean?" Sarah turned around, leaning against the counter. She looked so much like Frank when she was serious, the same furrow between her brows, the same thoughtful expression. "Remember last year when Grandma needed that expensive heart medication? She told me not to worry about helping her pay for it. I thought it was strange because I knew her pension barely covered her basic expenses." Eleanor's hands began to shake. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Mom, every time Dad's name comes up, you," Sarah gestured helplessly. "You get so angry. Like last night at my birthday dinner." She crossed the kitchen and sat across from Eleanor. "I didn't want to make things worse. But he's been paying her bills. Behind my back. Behind everyone's back." Eleanor's voice rose slightly, then fell as she saw her daughter's pained expression. "I don't understand why." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. "Maybe because it was the right thing to do? Dad's always been like that, helping people quietly, never wanting recognition. But after everything that happened between us." Eleanor's voice trailed off as memories flooded back, the fights about money, the cold silences, the final bitter days of their marriage. "I've said such horrible things about him, to him." "I know, Mom." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "We all know. But Dad never stopped caring about this family, even after the divorce." Eleanor stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to check something. At your grandmother's house. There might be papers, bills." "Mom, wait," Sarah called after her. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No, honey. I need to do this myself." Eleanor gathered her purse, her movements jerky with nervous energy. "Thank you for being honest with me. I'm sorry about ruining your birthday dinner." "It's okay, Mom." Sarah walked her to the door. "Just try to keep an open mind, okay? About Dad? There might be more you don't know." The drive to her mother's small ranch house took 15 minutes, but to Eleanor it felt like hours. Her mind raced with questions. How long had Frank been helping? Why hadn't her mother told her? The same man she'd wished dead just yesterday had been quietly supporting her family all along. Eleanor parked in her mother's driveway, using the spare key to let herself in. The house was quiet. Her mother was still at the hospital for observation. Everything looked normal. The worn but clean furniture, the collection of family photos on the walls, the stack of magazines on the coffee table. But now Eleanor wondered what other secrets this familiar place held. She headed straight for her mother's home office, really just a converted sewing room with a small desk and filing cabinet. Her mother had always been organized about paperwork, keeping everything in labeled folders. Eleanor started opening drawers, her hands trembling slightly as she searched. In the bottom drawer, behind a folder of old tax returns, she found it, a stack of envelopes, all from the same address. She recognized Frank's neat handwriting immediately. The envelopes were unopened, each containing what appeared to be copies of payment receipts and canceled checks. Eleanor sank into her mother's chair, the stack of evidence in her lap. With shaking fingers, she opened the first envelope. A check carbon copy showed a payment to Memorial Hospital dated 3 years ago. Another envelope revealed regular payments to the pharmacy. Month after month, year after year, Frank had been quietly ensuring her mother's medical care was covered. The paper trembled in her hands as she continued discovering more proof of Frank's secret support. Each envelope told the same story. While she'd been nursing her bitterness, convinced he'd abandoned their family, Frank had been sacrificing who knew how much of his own money to help her mother. She clutched the papers tightly, her vision blurring with tears. The morning sun streaming through the window caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and Eleanor sat there, surrounded by years of hidden kindness she'd been too angry to see. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Frank's small front yard as Eleanor pulled up to his modest ranch house. The faded blue paint and well-worn welcome mat seemed to reflect Frank's humble nature. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she gathered her courage. The medical bills and payment records felt heavy in her purse. After finding them at her mother's house, she'd driven straight here, desperate for answers. The short concrete path to his front door had never seemed so long. Eleanor smoothed her gray-streaked hair and straightened her cardigan before pressing the doorbell. The chime echoed inside, followed by slow, steady footsteps. Her heart pounded as the door opened. Frank stood there in his familiar plaid shirt and worn jeans, looking older than she remembered from dinner just days ago. Deep lines creased his weathered face, and his silver hair had thinned considerably. But his eyes, those gentle brown eyes, held the same steady gaze she'd known for 40 years. "Eleanor," he said quietly, neither surprised nor upset by her presence. "Would you like to come in?" She nodded stiffly, following him into the small living room. Everything was neat but sparse. A worn armchair, a simple couch, and basic furnishings. No TV, just a small radio on an end table. The only decorations were old photos of their children and grandchildren. "Can I get you some water?" Frank offered, his manner polite but reserved. "No." Eleanor pulled the papers from her purse with trembling hands. "I need to know about these." Frank glanced at the medical bills but didn't reach for them. He lowered himself carefully into his armchair, the springs creaking softly. "Ah," was all he said. "Why?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "Why would you pay my mother's medical bills? After everything." "It doesn't matter why," Frank replied softly. "Some things are better left unsaid." "Better left unsaid?" Eleanor's voice rose. "You've been paying thousands of dollars for her treatments for years, while She swallowed hard, remembering her cruel words at the birthday dinner. "While I've been horrible to you." Frank's expression remained gentle, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "Eleanor, please. What's done is done." "No!" She stood up, papers clutched to her chest. "I need to understand. Is this some kind of trick? Are you trying to make me feel guilty?" A flash of hurt crossed Frank's face before he masked it. Not everything has an ulterior motive. "Then why?" Eleanor paced the small room. "We've barely spoken in years except to argue. I've said terrible things about you to anyone who would listen. I even wished you." Her voice failed as shame washed over her. "Wished me dead?" Frank finished quietly. "I know, but that doesn't change what needed to be done." "What needed to be done?" Eleanor stopped pacing. "What does that mean?" Frank sighed, running a hand through his thin hair. "Your mother needed help. I could help. That's all there is to it." "That can't be all," Eleanor insisted. "Nobody just hands over that kind of money to their ex-wife's mother without a reason." "Some debts aren't meant to be spoken of," Frank said, his voice firm but kind. "Please, Eleanor, let it be." She stared at him, this quiet man who had once been her husband, trying to reconcile his actions with the bitter image she'd held onto for so long. The afternoon light caught the silver in his hair, highlighting how time had aged him. He looked tired, she realized. Tired, but peaceful. "I don't understand you," she whispered. "You don't have to." Frank stood slowly, signaling the conversation was over. "Give your mother my best." Eleanor walked numbly to the door, the papers now limp in her hands. Frank held the door open for her, ever courteous. She stepped outside into the warm afternoon air, more confused than when she'd arrived. As she walked to her car, a cheerful voice called out, "Oh, hello there." Eleanor turned to see an elderly woman watering flowers in the neighboring yard. The woman waved enthusiastically with her free hand. "You must be Eleanor," the neighbor said warmly. "I'm Margaret. I've heard so much about you from Frank's stories at the Veterans Shelter." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Veterans Shelter? Oh yes. Frank's there almost every weekend." Margaret beamed. "Such dedicated volunteer work he does, helping those poor souls get back on their feet. Always fixing things around the place too. You know how handy he is?" Eleanor glanced back at Frank's house, but the door was already closed. The medical bills felt even heavier in her hands as new questions began forming in her mind. Eleanor sat in her usual pew at First Presbyterian, 3 rows from the back. The familiar scent of wood polish and aging hymnals wrapped around her like a well-worn blanket. But today, everything felt different. Her eyes kept drifting to the empty spot across the aisle where Frank usually sat, his absence as noticeable as a missing tooth. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. The morning service proceeded as it always had, prayers, hymns, announcements, but Eleanor barely heard any of it. Her mind kept circling back to those medical bills she'd found, to Frank's quiet refusal to explain. Mrs. Peterson, who'd sat next to Eleanor for the past decade, leaned over during a quiet moment. "Frank's probably at the Veterans Shelter again," she whispered. "He never misses a Sunday unless he's helping someone." Eleanor nodded stiffly, unsure how to respond. She'd always assumed Frank came to church out of habit, just as she did. The idea that he might be missing service to help others didn't fit with the bitter picture she'd painted of him over the years. After the final hymn, while others filed out to enjoy coffee and donuts in the fellowship hall, Eleanor lingered behind. She studied the ceiling, noting the fresh paint and new wooden beams. The roof had leaked terribly last winter, she remembered. Somehow, it had been fixed before spring. "Beautiful work, isn't it?" Elder Thompson's voice startled her. The tall, silver-haired man had served on the church board for as long as Eleanor could remember. He stood beside her, also gazing upward. "We were blessed to have it repaired before any serious damage was done." "The church must have spent a fortune," Eleanor mused, remembering the fundraising campaign that had fallen short of its goal. Elder Thompson cleared his throat. "Actually, we had an anonymous donor cover most of the cost, though I suppose there's no harm in telling you now, it was Frank who made it possible." Eleanor's breath caught. "Frank? But how could he afford?" "He sold his truck," Elder Thompson said simply. "Said he could make do with his old bicycle. Wouldn't let us acknowledge him publicly, mind you. Just asked us to put the money to good use." The familiar Ford pickup that had disappeared from Frank's driveway months ago, Eleanor had assumed he'd finally junked the ancient vehicle. Instead, he'd sold it to help repair a roof he sat under just once a week. Elder Thompson touched her arm gently. "Your ex-husband is a humble man, Eleanor. Always has been. Even when the arthritis in his hands got so bad he could barely hold a hammer, he still showed up every Saturday to help with building maintenance." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Arthritis? I didn't know." "Oh yes, for years now. But he never complains, just wraps those hands and keeps working." The elder's kind eyes held no judgment, but Eleanor felt shame curl in her stomach. Last month he spent 3 weekends helping Widow Jenkins fix her porch steps. Wouldn't take a dime for his trouble. More pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The envelope of cash Eleanor's mother received every month for groceries. The anonymous donation that had helped their son pay for his textbooks last semester. The mysterious handyman who fixed Mrs. Peterson's leaky faucet for free. Eleanor sank into the nearest pew, her legs suddenly weak. The morning light through the stained glass seemed to mock her, illuminating all the things she'd been too angry to see. "Are you all right, dear?" Elder Thompson asked. Eleanor's voice cracked. "I've said such horrible things about him. To him, I thought he'd abandoned us all, but he's been." "Sometimes the quietest servants do the most good," the elder said softly. "Frank never wanted recognition. He just saw needs and tried to meet them." Eleanor stared at the cross hanging above the altar, remembering how Frank used to pray there long after services ended. She'd always assumed he was showing off his piety. Now she wondered what burdens he'd been laying down in those private moments. The sound of laughter drifted in from the fellowship hall, where the congregation shared coffee and conversation. Eleanor remained rooted to the pew, her world tilting on its axis. Here, in this sanctuary, where she'd nursed her bitterness for so many years, the truth was finally breaking through. The man she'd divorced, the man she'd cursed at her daughter's birthday dinner, had been quietly serving others all along, including her own family. "Who is he, really?" she whispered to herself, the question echoing in the empty sanctuary. She thought she'd known Frank so well, his faults, his failures, the ways he'd disappointed her. But now those certainties were crumbling, leaving her with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. The Frank she'd created in her mind, selfish, distant, cold, was dissolving in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. Elder Thompson had moved on to the fellowship hall, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. She sat there, surrounded by the evidence of Frank's generosity in the very beams above her head, feeling like a stranger in her own story. The sunlight shifted, the rainbow patterns on the pews sliding into new configurations. Eleanor watched them move, her mind replaying a decade of bitter accusations, while a very different truth had been playing out in the background. "Who is he, really?" she whispered again, the question taking root in her heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked parking lot of the Veterans Support Center as Eleanor pulled into an empty space. The building was a weathered two-story structure with faded red bricks and a sign that had seen better days. She gripped her steering wheel, suddenly unsure about coming here. Through her windshield, she watched two men in military caps helping a third man navigate the front steps with his walker. Their patience and teamwork touched something in her heart, making her previous anger seem small and petty. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor stepped out of her car. The late summer air was already thick with humidity, and her cotton blouse clung uncomfortably to her back. As she approached the entrance, the heavy glass door swung open, held by a young man in cargo shorts and a prosthetic leg. "Welcome to the center, ma'am," he said with a warm smile. "Can I help you find something?" Eleanor smoothed her hair nervously. "I'm looking for information about Frank Mitchell. I understand he volunteers here?" The young man's face lit up. "Oh, Mr. Frank. Sure, come on in. I'm Jake." He led her into a busy common area where several veterans gathered around tables, some playing cards, others just talking over coffee. "Mr. Frank's not here today. He usually comes in Tuesdays and Thursdays, but Maria in the office can tell you all about him. She runs the place." Jake guided Eleanor down a short hallway, lined with bulletin boards covered in flyers and announcements. They stopped at a small office where a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair was working at a computer. "Hey, Maria, this lady's asking about Mr. Frank," Jake called out before heading back to his post. Maria looked up and smiled. "Well, hello there. I'm Maria Vasquez. Are you a friend of Frank's?" Eleanor hesitated. I'm his ex-wife." If Maria was surprised, she didn't show it. "Please, have a seat." She gestured to a chair beside her desk. "Frank's one of our most dedicated volunteers. Been coming here for years." Eleanor sat down, noticing the photographs on Maria's desk. Smiling veterans, holiday parties, award ceremonies. In one, she spotted Frank in the background, bent over a wheelchair with tools in his hand. "What exactly does he do here?" Eleanor asked. "Oh, goodness, what doesn't he do?" Maria chuckled. "His main thing is fixing wheelchairs and walkers. We get a lot of donated equipment, but most of it needs repairs. Frank can fix just about anything with moving parts." She pulled open a drawer and retrieved a folder. "Look at this," These are thank you notes from some of the vets he's helped." She handed Eleanor several handwritten cards. Eleanor read them slowly, her throat tightening. "Dear Mr. Frank, the wheelchair works better than new now. God bless you for helping an old soldier get around." Another one read, "Thanks for fixing my walker and for all our talks. You helped me see there's still good in the world. But it's more than just repairs," Maria continued. "Frank mentors our younger vets, especially those struggling with the transition to civilian life. He listens without judging, shares his own experiences. Sometimes that's worth more than any mechanical fix." A gray-haired man appeared in the doorway, leaning on a cane. "Sorry to interrupt, Maria, but did I hear someone mention Frank?" "Come in, Bill." Maria waved him over. "This is Eleanor, Frank's ex-wife." Bill's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, now. Frank's helped a lot of us here, ma'am. Fixed my wheelchair last month when the VA said I'd have to wait 6 weeks for a new one. Wouldn't take a dime for it either." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "He never mentioned any of this." "That's Frank for you," Bill nodded. "Never talks about himself, but I've seen him slip grocery gift cards to guys he knows are having a rough time. Done it myself. That's how I noticed." Maria added, "He brought in a bunch of winter coats last December. Said he found them on sale. Later I learned he'd been setting aside money all year to buy them." Eleanor stood up suddenly, needing air. "Thank you, I should go. Would you like to see the workshop?" Maria asked gently. "It's where Frank spends most of his time here." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Maria led her down another hallway to a room that smelled of machine oil and rubber. Tools hung neatly on pegboards, and several wheelchairs in various states of repair lined the walls. A workbench held scattered parts and repair manuals. "He organized this whole space himself," Maria explained. "Used to be just a storage room full of broken equipment. Now it's a proper workshop. Frank says every piece we fix is one more veteran who can get around with dignity." Eleanor ran her fingers along the workbench, imagining Frank here, patiently working to help others while she'd been home nursing her bitterness. All those years, she'd painted him as selfish, uncaring. But here was evidence of a different man, one who gave his time and money freely, who worked quietly to ease others' burdens. "Would you like to leave him a message?" Maria asked. "He'll be here tomorrow." Eleanor shook her head. "No, thank you. I need to think." She walked quickly back through the common area, barely registering Jake's friendly goodbye as she pushed through the front door. In her car, Eleanor sat with her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The Frank she'd known, or thought she'd known, was a distant, emotionally unavailable man who'd abandoned his family's needs. But this Frank, the one who fixed broken things and helped broken people, who gave without recognition or reward. Who was he? She watched another veteran make his way carefully up the shelter's steps, using a walker that Frank had probably repaired. Her anger of the past few days dissolved into something else, a deep, unsettling shame. How many other things had she been wrong about? Eleanor's hands trembled as she climbed the worn concrete steps to her son Michael's third-floor apartment. The stairwell smelled of old carpet and cooking spices, and each step felt heavier than the last. She hadn't visited him here before. Their relationship had been strained ever since the divorce. The hallway was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. She found apartment 3C and stood there for a moment, gathering her courage. The peeling paint on the doorframe reminded her of just how modest her son's living situation was. She knocked 3 times, her knuckles rapping against the hollow metal door. "Just a minute," Michael's voice called from inside. She heard shuffling, then the click of locks being undone. The door opened, and there stood her son, tall and lean like his father, with the same serious set to his jaw. His expression shifted from surprise to wariness. "Mom?" He blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What are you doing here?" I needed to talk to you." Eleanor forced a smile. "May I come in?" Michael hesitated, then stepped aside. "Sure. Sorry about the mess. I wasn't expecting company." The apartment was small but tidy, with textbooks stacked on a coffee table and a laptop surrounded by papers on a fold-out desk. A few dishes sat in the drying rack by the sink, and a physics poster decorated one wall. It was a typical graduate student's apartment, but something about seeing her son's living space made Eleanor's heart ache. "Can I get you something to drink?" Michael offered stiffly. "Water? Coffee?" "Water would be nice, thank you." While Michael filled a glass in the kitchen, Eleanor noticed details that hadn't been apparent at first glance. The furniture wasn't just modest, it was carefully maintained old pieces, the kind Frank always knew how to fix up and make last. Michael handed her the water and gestured to a worn armchair. Eleanor sat, clutching the glass like a lifeline. "So," Michael remained standing, arms crossed, "what brings you here?" Eleanor took a sip of water, buying time. "I've been learning some things lately, about your father." Michael's posture stiffened. "What about him?" "I found out he's been paying for Grandma's medical treatments." She watched her son's face carefully. "And I wondered, has he been helping you too?" The silence that followed was heavy. Michael moved to the window, staring out at the parking lot below. "He asked me not to tell you. So he has been helping." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. Michael turned back to face her, his expression pained. "Mom, you have to understand. When I got accepted to graduate school, I was going to turn it down. The scholarships weren't enough, and I knew you couldn't help. But Frank could." Eleanor finished softly. "He showed up at my apartment one day, right after I'd mailed my rejection letter." Michael's voice grew quiet. "He had this envelope full of cash. Said he'd been saving it for years, just in case. When I tried to refuse," he said. Michael swallowed hard. "He said his father never got to see him go to college, and he wasn't about to let his son miss that chance." Eleanor's hands began to shake so badly she had to set down her water glass. "How? How much has he helped?" "He pays half my rent. Helps with books when he can." Michael ran a hand through his hair, another gesture so like his father's. "Sometimes he brings groceries. Fixed my car twice when it broke down." "All this time?" Eleanor whispered. Michael nodded. "He made me promise not to tell you. Said it would only upset you more." "More than what?" "More than you already were about the divorce. About everything." Michael sat heavily on the couch. "He knew you thought he'd abandoned us financially. But Mom, he's been here. Maybe not in person, but he's been supporting us all along." Eleanor pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. The memory of her cruel words at the birthday dinner came rushing back. "I wish your dad was dead." While all this time he'd been quietly making sure their son could pursue his dreams. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she managed to ask. "Would you have believed me?" Michael's voice was gentle but firm. "You were so angry, Mom. Every time his name came up, you'd get that look in your eyes. It was easier just not to talk about him." Eleanor stood up suddenly, needing to move. She paced the small living room, taking in more details. The warm blanket draped over the couch that looked like one from their old house, the toolkit in the corner that was definitely Frank's brand of choice, the coffee maker that had been carefully repaired instead of replaced. "Does he visit often?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Once a month or so. He helps with maintenance around the place. The landlord even gives me a break on rent because Dad fixes things in other units too." It was too much. The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over. Eleanor grabbed her purse, needing to escape before she completely broke down. "Mom?" Michael stood, concern replacing his earlier guardedness. "I need to go," she choked out. "I'm sorry, I need some air." She fumbled with the door handle, her vision blurred by tears. Behind her, she heard Michael call out, "Mom, wait!" But she was already hurrying down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell as she fled. She made it to her car before the sobs overtook her completely. There, in the parking lot of her son's apartment building, Eleanor finally let herself cry. For the years of hatred she'd nursed, for the kindness she'd refused to see, and for the man who had never stopped being a father, even when she'd tried to erase him from their lives. Through her tears, she stared up at Michael's window, wondering what other secrets Frank had kept, what other quiet acts of love she had missed in her determination to see only the worst in him. The autumn wind rattled Eleanor's windows as she sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by stacks of old paperwork. her reading glasses perched on her nose as she methodically worked through years of financial documents she'd stuffed into boxes and forgotten. The table lamp cast a warm glow over the scattered papers, creating long shadows across the carpet. "There has to be something here," she muttered, picking up another manila folder. Her back ached from hours of searching, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not when she was finally beginning to see the truth about Frank. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10, its deep chimes echoing through the quiet house. Eleanor rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her cooling cup of tea. That's when she noticed a thick envelope she didn't recognize, tucked between old utility bills. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. Inside were mortgage documents from 8 years ago, during the worst period of her life, when she'd lost her job at the insurance company and nearly lost the house. She'd never understood how she'd managed to keep it, had assumed the bank had simply been lenient, but there it was in black and white. 3 months of mortgage payments, made in full. The name on the cashier's checks was crystal clear. Frank Davidson. "Oh my God," Eleanor whispered, her fingers tracing over his familiar signature. She remembered that time vividly, lying awake at night, terrified of losing her home, cursing Frank for the divorce that had left her struggling. She'd blamed him for everything. More papers spilled from the envelope, bank statements, letters from the mortgage company. Each one told the same story. Frank had stepped in, quietly keeping her afloat when she was drowning. Eleanor spread the documents across the carpet, arranging them chronologically. The dates aligned perfectly with her darkest months. She'd been so bitter then, convinced he'd abandoned her. Yet here was proof that he'd been watching out for her all along. She picked up a final notice from the bank, now stamped "Resolved." The memory hit her like a physical blow. She'd received this letter on a Friday, spent the weekend in panic, then gone to the bank on Monday to beg for more time. The clerk had smiled and told her everything was taken care of. She'd assumed it was divine intervention. "It was you," she said to the empty room. "It was always you." Standing up, Eleanor gathered the papers with trembling hands and carried them to her kitchen table. The linoleum floor felt cold under her feet as she sank into a chair, spreading the evidence of Frank's secret generosity before her. The kitchen was still and dark except for the light above the sink. It was the same kitchen where she'd sat alone so many nights, nursing her resentment, imagining Frank living carefree while she struggled. How wrong she'd been. Tears began to blur her vision as the full weight of her misjudgment crashed over her. For years, she'd painted him as the villain in their story, spewing venom about him to anyone who would listen. And all that time, he'd been quietly catching her when she fell. The clock ticked steadily in the silence as Eleanor stared at the papers, each one a testament to her ex-husband's character and her own blindness. Her throat tightened as she remembered every harsh word, every bitter accusation she'd hurled at him. "While I cursed him, he was saving me," she whispered into the quiet kitchen. And finally, after all these years, Eleanor broke down in deep, racking sobs. Early morning sunlight filtered through the hospital room's thin curtains, casting a soft glow on Eleanor's mother's face. The medical equipment beeped steadily in the background as Eleanor adjusted the scratchy vinyl chair closer to the bed. Her mother looked frail against the white sheets, but her eyes held that familiar warmth that had comforted Eleanor throughout her life. "Come closer, dear," her mother said, patting the edge of the bed. Her voice was tired but steady. "There's something I need to tell you about Frank." Eleanor's stomach tightened at the mention of his name. She perched carefully on the bed's edge, taking her mother's delicate hand in hers. "What about Frank, Mom?" Her mother's fingers squeezed hers gently. "You know, he's been coming to see me every Wednesday for years now." She smiled, her face lighting up with genuine affection. "He brings me groceries, helps me with the house repairs, and just sits and talks with me." Eleanor felt her throat constrict. "Every Wednesday? Rain or shine?" Her mother nodded. "Even during that terrible snowstorm last winter, he showed up with hot soup and made sure my heating was working properly." Eleanor stared at their joined hands, remembering how she'd blamed Frank for neglecting her family. All this time, he'd been quietly caring for her mother while she'd been nursing her bitterness. "But why didn't you tell me?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother's eyes grew misty. "He asked me not to, said it might upset you." She paused, reaching for the water glass on her bedside table. Eleanor helped her take a sip before she continued. "That man, Eleanor, he's treated me better than my own son-in-law ever did. Your father left us with nothing but debts and broken promises. But Frank," she shook her head slowly, "Frank has been my guardian angel." Eleanor felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Mom, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't, dear. You were so angry with him after the divorce. But do you know what he told me once?" Her mother's voice grew stronger. "He said, 'You're still my mother, divorce or not.' Can you imagine? After everything that happened between you two, he still considered me family." The weight of shame pressed heavily on Eleanor's chest as she remembered her outburst at the birthday dinner. Her mother continued, unaware of her daughter's internal struggle. "When I first got sick, I was terrified about the medical bills. But Frank came to me and said not to worry." Her mother's eyes grew distant with the memory. He'd already arranged everything with the hospital. He said it was the least he could do for family. Eleanor wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "But how? His pension isn't that much." "He took extra jobs," her mother explained. "Handyman work, mostly. I heard from Mrs. Peterson next door that he fixed her roof last summer in that awful heat." She squeezed Eleanor's hand again. "He never wanted recognition, never asked for anything in return. Just kept showing up, keeping me company, making sure I was okay." The morning light had grown stronger now, warming the small room. Eleanor could hear nurses chatting in the hallway, the sound of a cart being wheeled past the door. But her focus remained on her mother's face, seeing the genuine love and gratitude there when she spoke about Frank. "You know what touched me the most?" her mother continued. "He brings me flowers every year on my birthday. Nothing fancy, just simple daisies from his garden. But he remembers Eleanor, every single year." Eleanor thought about her own birthday gifts to her mother, usually rushed purchases from the department store, when she remembered it all. The contrast made her heart ache. "He saved my life more times than you'll ever know," her mother said softly, "not just with the medical bills. It's the little things, checking my medication, driving me to appointments, just being there when I felt lonely." She looked directly into Eleanor's eyes. "That's the kind of man your Frank is." "He's not my Frank anymore, Mom," Eleanor whispered. Her mother's face softened with understanding. "No, perhaps not. But he's still the same good man he always was. Maybe even better now, though you couldn't see it through your hurt." Eleanor stood up slowly, needing to move, to process everything she was hearing. She walked to the window and looked out at the hospital parking lot below. Somewhere out there, Frank was probably helping someone else, quietly making the world a little better without asking for credit or thanks. "I've been so wrong about him," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "We all make mistakes, dear," her mother said gently. "The question is what we do once we realize them." Eleanor turned back to the bed and carefully embraced her mother, mindful of the IV lines. She held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap that her mother had used for as long as she could remember. In her mind, she made a silent promise to thank Frank for everything he'd done, though the very thought made her stomach flutter with anxiety and pride. Her mother patted her back softly. "It's never too late to make things right, Eleanor." Eleanor nodded against her mother's shoulder, but said nothing. The words of gratitude she needed to say to Frank stuck in her throat, held back by years of practiced resentment and the stubborn pride that had become her shield. But for the first time in years, she felt the shield beginning to crack. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she dialed Frank's number. She had to look it up in her old address book, the pages yellow and worn with time. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar gruff voice answered. "Hello? Frank? It's Eleanor." She paused, her throat suddenly dry. "I was wondering if you'd meet me for coffee at Miller's Diner. Tomorrow morning, maybe?" The silence on the other end stretched so long she thought he might have hung up. Finally, he cleared his throat. "What time? 9?" Her voice came out higher than intended. "All right." The next morning, Eleanor arrived at Miller's Diner 20 minutes early. The small bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. She chose a booth near the window, remembering how Frank always liked to watch people pass by. The vinyl seat squeaked as she settled in, smoothing her blouse for the 10th time. She'd changed outfits 3 times that morning, finally settling on a simple blue top she'd bought last spring. The waitress brought her a menu, but Eleanor just ordered coffee, her stomach too knotted for food. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bell chimed again. Frank walked in, punctual as always. He wore pressed khakis and a clean plaid shirt, his silver hair neatly combed. Eleanor's heart squeezed at the sight of him, moving a bit slower than she remembered, favoring his left knee slightly. "Eleanor," he nodded, sliding into the seat across from her. "Thank you for coming." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, grateful for its warmth. "I ordered you coffee. Black, right? Still remember?" A slight smile touched his lips. The waitress appeared with his coffee, and they both thanked her. Eleanor watched as Frank added a packet of sugar to his cup, a new habit, she noted. "Your mother doing better?" he asked, stirring his coffee carefully. "Yes, much better. The doctors say she can go home next week." Eleanor took a deep breath. "Frank, that's partly why I wanted to talk. I found out about the medical bills. And other things." He shifted in his seat, his expression unchanged. "Ah, why didn't you tell me? All these years you've been." She gestured helplessly. Frank took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Wouldn't have made a difference back then. You needed to be angry. I understood that. But it wasn't fair to you. I said such horrible things." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "Water under the bridge." The waitress returned, and they both ordered toast, neither really hungry but needing the distraction. Eleanor watched as Frank methodically arranged the jelly packets by color, just like he used to do at their kitchen table years ago. "I visited the veterans' shelter," she said softly. His hand stilled. "Did you now? They spoke very highly of you. Said you're there almost every weekend." Frank shrugged, but Eleanor caught a hint of color in his cheeks. "Just trying to be useful. Some of those young fellows need someone to talk to. And the church roof? Needed fixing." He picked up his coffee cup again, avoiding her eyes. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Our son told me about the tuition help." Frank's shoulders tensed. "He wasn't supposed to mention that. Why do you hide it? All the good you do?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching a young couple with a baby pass by the window. "Doing good isn't about getting credit. Besides," he gave a small, self-deprecating smile, "I'm not much good at explaining myself. Never was." The toast arrived, and they fell into silence as they spread butter and jelly on their pieces. Eleanor noticed Frank still cut his toast diagonally, another old habit that hadn't changed. "Remember that time at the lake?" she found herself saying. "When you tried to teach me to fish?" A genuine smile crossed his face. "You caught more seaweed than fish, and you kept untangling my line without complaining. Until you hooked my hat and sent it flying." Eleanor felt a laugh bubble up, surprising herself. "I'd forgotten about that. You looked so shocked." Frank's eyes crinkled at the corners as he chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. That hat was never the same. Their laughter mingled in the space between them, and for a moment Eleanor saw past the gray hair and weathered face to the kind, patient man she'd fallen in love with decades ago. He was still there, she realized, just quieter, more worn, but somehow stronger too. The simple joy of sharing a memory faded into a comfortable silence as they finished their toast. Frank wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, folding it precisely as he always had. Some things never changed, Eleanor thought, and for the first time in years, that thought brought comfort rather than bitterness. The morning sun streamed through Eleanor's kitchen window as she washed her coffee mug, still thinking about her conversation with Frank at the diner 3 days ago. Their talk had been awkward at first, but as the minutes passed, the tension had slowly melted away like ice cream on a warm day. They'd even shared a small laugh over old memories. The shrill ring of her phone cut through her thoughts. She dried her hands on a dish towel and reached for the receiver. "Mrs. Eleanor Brooks?" a professional voice asked. "Yes, speaking. This is Mercy General Hospital. We're calling about Frank Brooks." Eleanor's heart skipped. "What happened?" "Mr. Brooks collapsed while working at the veterans' shelter. He's been brought to our emergency department." The mug slipped from Eleanor's fingers, clattering into the sink. "I'll be right there." She grabbed her purse and car keys with shaking hands, barely remembering to lock the front door behind her. The drive to the hospital was a blur of traffic lights and turn signals, her mind racing with possibilities. Frank had seemed fine at coffee, tired maybe, but fine. The emergency room waiting area buzzed with typical morning activity. Eleanor approached the front desk, her voice unsteady. "I'm here for Frank Brooks. I'm his ex-wife." The receptionist typed on her computer. "He's being examined now. Please have a seat, and someone will come get you soon." Eleanor sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. The waiting room television droned on about the weather, but she couldn't focus on anything except the double doors leading to the treatment area. Every time they swung open, she held her breath. A young nurse emerged. "Family of Frank Brooks?" Eleanor shot to her feet. "Here, please follow me." They walked through sterile corridors that smelled of disinfectant. The nurse led her to a small room where Frank lay on a hospital bed, looking smaller somehow in the thin hospital gown. His face was pale, but his eyes opened when she entered. "Eleanor?" His voice was weak. "You didn't have to come." "Of course I did." She moved closer to the bed, noticing the IV in his arm and the heart monitor beeping steadily beside him. "What happened?" Before Frank could answer, a doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand. He was middle-aged, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Brooks, how are you feeling now?" "Better," Frank said, though Eleanor could see the effort it took for him to speak. The doctor turned to Eleanor. "Are you family?" "Ex-wife," she said, then added quickly. "But I'm the closest family he has right now." The doctor nodded. "Mr. Brooks, would you like her to stay while we discuss your condition?" Frank hesitated, then nodded. "The tests show you've developed a serious heart condition," the doctor began. "Your heart muscle has weakened significantly, likely due to prolonged stress and inadequate self-care." He flipped through his papers. "According to your records, you've missed several recommended checkups over the past few years." Eleanor's throat tightened. She knew why those checkups cost money Frank had been giving away to others, to her family. The doctor continued, his tone gentle but firm. "You need immediate treatment, Mr. Brooks. We're looking at medication, possibly surgery, and definitely lifestyle changes." He paused. "However, I see you don't have current health insurance." Frank's eyes dropped to his hands. "Lost it when I had to cut back my work hours." The doctor's expression grew concerned. "The treatment plan we're recommending, well, it's expensive. There are payment plans available, but without insurance." He let the sentence hang in the air. Eleanor stood frozen, horror washing over her as the full picture emerged. Frank, who had given so much to others, to her mother, to their children, to complete strangers, had sacrificed his own health and financial security in the process. The man she had cursed at her daughter's birthday dinner might die because he'd chosen to help others instead of himself. The heart monitor's steady beeping seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. Eleanor stared at Frank's weathered face, seeing for the first time the deep exhaustion etched there. How long had he been hiding his condition? How many nights had he laid awake, worried about bills, yet still choosing to give what little he had to others? The doctor cleared his throat. "I'll give you some time to process this. A financial counselor will come by later to discuss options." He made a note on his clipboard and left the room quietly. Eleanor remained standing at Frank's bedside, her mind spinning with the cruel irony of it all. The man she had once wished dead might actually die not from spite or malice, but from an abundance of love he had given away so freely, asking nothing in return. The magnitude of her past hatred crashed over her like a wave, threatening to drown her in shame. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. What could she possibly say to make this right? Frank's eyes met hers, and incredibly, he offered a small smile. "Don't worry about me, Eleanor. I've had a good life." His quiet acceptance only made it worse. Eleanor's hands gripped the metal rail of the hospital bed until her knuckles turned white. The steady beep of the heart monitor continued its rhythm, each sound a reminder of how precarious Frank's situation had become. Through the window, she could see the hospital parking lot filling up with cars. people going about their normal day, unaware that in this small room a quiet hero was paying the ultimate price for his generosity. The morning sun that had seemed so bright in her kitchen now felt harsh and unforgiving, illuminating a truth she wished she could hide from. The man she had spent years hating had literally given his heart away, piece by piece, to help others, herself included. And now that same heart was failing him when he needed it most. The horror of this realization rooted her to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak, as the magnitude of Frank's sacrifice and her own blindness to it became devastatingly clear. Eleanor sat in her parked car outside County General Hospital, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the orange glow made the hospital windows look like they were on fire. She couldn't bring herself to leave, even though visiting hours had ended an hour ago. "How could I have been so blind?" she whispered to the empty car. The words hung heavy in the air, mixing with the gentle hum of the idle engine and the occasional whoosh of cars passing on the street behind her. Her mind wandered back to that awful birthday dinner, how she had stood up and screamed those terrible words at Frank. "I wish your dad was dead." The memory made her stomach twist into knots. Now here she was, sitting outside a hospital where Frank lay with a failing heart, and all she could think about were the countless cruel things she'd said over the years. "You never helped anyone but yourself." She had once spat at him during their divorce proceedings, but he had helped. He had helped so many people, including her, all while she'd been spreading poison about him to anyone who would listen. Eleanor's eyes burned with unshed tears as she remembered telling their children that their father didn't care about anyone but himself. All those years, Frank had been secretly paying their son's college tuition, keeping up her mortgage payments, taking care of her mother's medical bills. The dashboard clock blinked 8:47 p.m. A nurse walked past her car, heading home after her shift, her comfortable shoes scuffing against the asphalt. Eleanor watched her go, thinking about how Frank had spent countless hours at the veterans' shelter, fixing wheelchairs for people who couldn't afford repairs. "He gave everything," she murmured, her voice breaking. "He gave until there was nothing left for himself." The weight of it all pressed down on her chest. Every nasty comment she'd made at church coffee hour, every time she'd turned away when she saw him coming, every instant she'd refused to acknowledge his presence at family gatherings, it all came rushing back. She had built her anger into a wall so high she couldn't see over it, and now that wall was crumbling, revealing the truth she'd refused to see. Eleanor pulled down the sun visor and looked at herself in the small mirror. Her face was lined with worry, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. What kind of person wishes death on someone who's been so quietly good? She remembered the doctor's words from earlier. "Mr. Harrison has been dealing with this condition for some time. He's been pushing himself too hard, working too much, not taking care of himself." The doctor had paused then, looking at Eleanor with knowing eyes. "He's been more focused on taking care of others." A sob escaped her throat, echoing in the confined space of her car. She fumbled in her purse for a tissue, her hands shaking as she wiped her eyes. Through the windshield, she could see the hospital room where she knew Frank was resting. 3rd floor, 5th window from the left. The light was still on, casting a gentle glow into the darkening evening. "I spent years wishing him harm," she whispered, crumpling the tissue in her fist. "And all that time, he was." She couldn't finish the sentence. The truth was too painful to speak aloud. The memory of their coffee meeting just days ago now felt like a cruel joke. They had shared a moment of laughter, a brief glimpse of what could have been, only to have it shattered by this devastating news. She'd been so close to reaching out, to bridging the gap, and now, Eleanor's phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it out to find a text from their daughter. "How's Dad doing? Should I come down?" The simple question brought fresh tears to her eyes. Their children shouldn't have to deal with this. They shouldn't have to worry about their father's heart giving out because he'd spent years quietly sacrificing everything for others while their mother painted him as a villain. She set the phone down without responding. What could she say? That their father was lying in a hospital bed because he'd given away so much of himself that he couldn't afford his own medical care? That, while she'd been cursing his name, he'd been working himself to exhaustion, helping others? The guilt was overwhelming, pressing down on her like a physical weight. But as she sat there, watching people come and go from the hospital entrance, something else began to stir in her heart. It started small, like a tiny flame fighting against the wind, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. "It's not too late," she said firmly, straightening in her seat. The words surprised her with their certainty. It can't be too late. She grabbed her purse and took a deep breath. The time for sitting in dark parking lots feeling sorry for herself was over. Frank had spent years quietly helping others without expecting anything in return. Now it was her turn to step up, to make things right. Eleanor squared her shoulders and looked at her reflection one more time. "I don't deserve his forgiveness," she told herself, "but I'm going to earn it, whatever it takes." She got out of the car, her movements decisive now. The night air was cool against her tear-stained cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already racing with plans, calling their children, reaching out to the church community, contacting the veterans group where Frank volunteered. There had to be a way to help him, just as he had helped so many others. As she walked toward the hospital entrance, her heels clicking against the pavement, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. She might not be able to undo the past, but she could fight for Frank's future. She could make sure he knew he wasn't alone anymore. "I'm going to help you," she whispered, as if Frank could somehow hear her through the hospital walls. "Even if it's the last thing I do." The old wooden church doors creaked as Eleanor slipped into the back pew just as the morning service began. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the worn carpet. Her heart hammered against her ribs as Pastor Matthews led the congregation through the opening hymn. She barely heard the music. Her thoughts kept drifting to Frank's hospital room, where machines beeped steadily, and his face looked so pale against the white sheets. The doctors had used words like critical condition and limited options. The weight of those words pressed down on her shoulders like lead. When the time came for community prayers and sharing, Eleanor's legs felt like jelly as she stood. Several heads turned her way. She hadn't spoken in church for years. She gripped the back of the pew in front of her, steadying herself. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I need to confess something to all of you." The familiar faces turned toward her. Mrs. Peterson, who taught Sunday school, old Mr. Jenkins, who always dozed off during sermons, young families she'd watched grow up. They all knew her. They all knew Frank. "Last week, at my daughter's birthday dinner, I said something terrible." Eleanor's voice shook, but she forced herself to continue. "I told Frank, told everyone, that I wished he was dead." A collective intake of breath rippled through the congregation. Someone's hymnal dropped with a thud. "For years, I've been so angry, so bitter." Tears began sliding down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "I blamed Frank for everything that went wrong in my life. I convinced myself he was selfish, that he didn't care about anyone but himself." Her mother sat in her usual spot near the front, oxygen tank beside her chair. She reached for Eleanor's daughter's hand, squeezing it tight. "But I was wrong. So terribly wrong." Eleanor's voice grew stronger. "While I was cursing his name, Frank was quietly helping everyone around him. He paid for my mother's medical treatments without telling anyone. He helped our son through college when I couldn't. He even," she swallowed hard, "he even paid my mortgage when I was about to lose my house." Soft murmurs filled the church. Eleanor saw several people nodding. They knew. Of course they knew. Frank had helped so many of them too. He volunteers at the veterans' shelter. He fixes things around the church. He delivers meals to shut-ins. Each revelation felt like lifting a stone from her heart, and he never asked for recognition, never wanted anyone to know. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Jenkins was wide awake now, his weathered face solemn. "And now," Eleanor's voice broke again. "Now Frank is in the hospital with a serious heart condition, the doctors say." She had to pause, struggling to maintain composure. "The doctors say he needs expensive treatment, but he can't afford it. Because he gave everything away to help others, to help me, even when I hated him." The silence in the church was absolute. Even the babies seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. I stood in this very church and asked God to punish him." Eleanor's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "But Frank was more Christian than I ever was. He lived the words we sing about every Sunday. He turned the other cheek. He gave without expecting anything in return." Her daughter was crying openly now, head bowed. Several other members of the congregation were wiping their eyes. "I don't deserve forgiveness for how I treated him." Eleanor gripped the pew tighter. "But I'm standing here because I need to make this right. I need you all to know the truth about the man I wronged, about the quiet hero who walks among us, who never stopped showing kindness, even to those who hurt him most." Pastor Matthews stepped forward, his own eyes glistening. "Eleanor, thank you for your courage in sharing this with us. Sometimes God's greatest works happen in silence, through humble servants like Frank." The first whispers started in the front pews, spreading backward like ripples in a pond. Eleanor saw heads bent together, handkerchiefs passed from person to person. Mrs. Peterson was already pulling out her checkbook. Mr. Jenkins had struggled to his feet, arthritis forgotten as he made his way to Eleanor's pew. The murmurs grew louder, but they weren't sounds of judgment. They were the gentle stirrings of compassion awakening, of a community preparing to rally around one of their own. Eleanor saw it in their faces, the same revelation she'd experienced, the same desire to make things right. Tissues appeared from purses and pockets as more people began to cry. Some nodded firmly, determination settling over their features. Others reached for their phones, already texting family members. The atmosphere in the church had transformed from quiet reverence to purposeful energy. Through her tears, Eleanor watched as her confession sparked something bigger than herself. The truth about Frank's quiet generosity had touched a chord in every heart present. The very air seemed charged with emotion as the congregation absorbed her words and began responding with their own silent promises to help. The truth was finally out, and with it came not the condemnation Eleanor had feared, but a surge of collective empathy that filled the sacred space like a healing balm. The church members' faces showed what words couldn't express. They understood, they forgave, and they were ready to act. The church basement hummed with activity as Eleanor directed volunteers around folding tables laden with sign-up sheets and donation boxes. Morning light streamed through the small windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged flyers announcing the upcoming benefit dinner for Frank. "Put those chairs along the wall, please," Eleanor called out to two teenage boys from the youth group. She checked her growing to-do list, the paper already creased from constant handling. The community's response had been immediate and overwhelming after her emotional confession during the service. Martha from the quilting circle approached, clutching a notebook. "I've got 10 ladies ready to bake for the sale next weekend," she said, her eyes bright with purpose. "And my husband's band agreed to play at the dinner for free." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Thank you, Martha. I never expected." She paused, swallowing hard. "Now, don't you start crying again," Martha said softly, patting Eleanor's arm. "We all love Frank. He's helped every one of us at some point or another." More volunteers filtered in throughout the morning. Eleanor's daughter, Sarah, arrived with boxes of printed flyers featuring Frank's photo and the words, "Heroes Among Us," in bold letters. The image showed Frank in his characteristic plaid shirt, caught mid-laugh while building a wheelchair ramp at the Veterans Center. "Mom, the print shop donated these," Sarah said, setting down the boxes. "And look who I brought." Eleanor turned to see her son Michael standing awkwardly in the doorway. Their eyes met, and he gave a slight nod. "I took some time off work," he said. "Thought maybe you could use the help." Tears threatened again, but Eleanor blinked them back. "There's plenty to do," she managed. "We need someone to coordinate with the local businesses." As the morning wore on, Eleanor's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages. The owner of the Italian restaurant offered to cater the benefit dinner. The high school principal volunteered the gymnasium for the event. A local band wanted to perform. The newspaper asked to run a story. "Mrs. Johnson's here to see you," Sarah called out, gesturing to the elderly widow who lived down Frank Street. Mrs. Johnson clutched her purse tightly. "I don't have much," she said, her voice wavering. "But Frank fixed my furnace last winter and wouldn't take a dime," he said. I reminded him of his mother. She pressed a wrinkled envelope into Eleanor's hands. "It's only $50, but—" "It's perfect," Eleanor assured her, hugging the fragile woman. "Every bit helps." By afternoon, the basement walls were covered with sign-up sheets. The local hardware store where Frank often bought supplies pledged a significant donation. The veterans group he volunteered with organized a separate raffle. Even the church youth group planned a car wash. Eleanor sat down heavily in a metal folding chair, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Her daughter brought her a cup of coffee and sat beside her. "How's Dad doing today?" Sarah asked quietly. "About the same. The doctors want to schedule surgery soon, but—" Eleanor's voice trailed off, thinking of the astronomical costs. "He's going to hate all this attention, you know," Sarah said with a small smile. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, but he needs to understand he's not alone. All these years he's been quietly helping everyone else. Now it's our turn." The church secretary poked her head in. "Eleanor, there's a call from the mayor's office. They want to declare a Frank Thompson Day to kick off the fundraising." Eleanor pressed her hands to her face, feeling tears threaten again. A warm hand touched her shoulder. Her son Michael. "Mom, why don't you take a break? I'll handle the mayor's office." His voice was gentle, reminding her so much of Frank's quiet strength that her heart ached. Later that afternoon, Eleanor drove to the hospital, her car trunk filled with posters and flyers. She found Frank propped up in bed, looking tired but alert. The small TV mounted on the wall was playing an old Western movie with the sound turned low. "The nurses say you haven't been eating," she scolded gently, setting her purse down. Frank shrugged. "Not hungry." His eyes narrowed as he noticed the papers in her hands. "What's all that?" Eleanor hesitated, then pulled out one of the flyers. She watched his face as he read it, saw his eyes widen, then fill with tears. "Eleanor, no," he protested weakly. "I don't want." "It's already happening," she cut him off firmly. "The whole town wants to help. You can't stop it." She showed him more materials, the event schedules, the donation lists, the growing number of volunteers. Frank's hands trembled as he looked through them. "But why?" he whispered. "I never did anything special." Eleanor sat on the edge of his bed, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done everything special, Frank. Every quiet act of kindness, every secret gift, every time you helped someone without taking credit, it all mattered. These people remember. They know who you really are." A tear rolled down Frank's weathered cheek. "I just did what needed doing," he said softly. "Well, now what needs doing is letting people help you," Eleanor replied. "The benefit dinner is next week. Sarah's picking out your tie." Frank looked down at the papers in his lap, overwhelmed. More tears fell as he read the names of people he'd helped over the years, now signing up to help him in return. Mrs. Johnson's modest donation. The hardware store owner's pledge. The veterans raffle. The mayor's proclamation. "I don't deserve all this," he whispered. Eleanor touched his hand gently. "Yes, you do. For once in your life, Frank Thompson, you're going to let people show you how much you matter to them." He didn't respond, but his tears fell freely now as he looked at the growing evidence of a community's love, a love he'd never sought, but had earned through countless acts of quiet generosity. Eleanor watched him, remembering her cruel words at the birthday dinner that seemed so long ago now. She saw in his tears not just embarrassment at the attention, but a profound humility that had always been at his core. The afternoon sun slanted through the hospital window, casting a warm glow over Frank's bed as he continued to read through the papers with trembling hands, each new example of support bringing fresh tears to his eyes. The fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room cast a harsh glow over Eleanor's tired face as she checked her watch for the 10th time that hour. 6:45 a.m. Frank had gone into surgery just 45 minutes ago, but it felt like days. She shifted in the uncomfortable plastic chair, trying to find a position that would ease her anxiety. Their daughter Sarah sat beside her, thumbing through an old magazine without really reading it. Dark circles under her eyes revealed she'd barely slept the night before. On Sarah's lap, her 4-year-old daughter Emma dozed peacefully, clutching a worn teddy bear. Across from them, Their son Michael paced back and forth, his shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. Every few minutes he'd stop to stare out the window at the gray morning sky, then resume his restless walking. His wife Jenny watched him with concern, their teenage son Tommy slumped against her shoulder, earbuds firmly in place. "Would anyone like some coffee?" Eleanor asked, desperate to do something useful. Her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. "I'll go with you, Mom," Sarah said, carefully shifting Emma onto Jenny's lap. The little girl stirred but didn't wake. Together, mother and daughter walked to the small coffee station down the hall. Eleanor's hand shook as she poured coffee into paper cups. "He's going to be okay," Sarah said softly, touching her mother's arm. "Dad's tough." Eleanor nodded, blinking back tears. "I know. It's just—" She set down the coffee pot before she could spill it. "I wasted so many years being angry at him. What if—" "Don't," Sarah interrupted firmly. "No what-ifs. We're all here now. That's what matters." They returned to the waiting room with coffee for everyone except the children. Michael had finally settled into a chair, his leg bouncing nervously. Tommy had removed his earbuds and was now playing a card game with Emma, who had awakened and seemed determined to teach her older cousin go fish. Eleanor watched her grandchildren with a mixture of love and regret. How many family gatherings had been tense and awkward because of her bitterness? How many times had Frank sat quietly at the edges, wanting to participate but holding back because of her sharp tongue? The morning crawled by. Nurses passed through occasionally, but none had any updates. Eleanor found herself studying the familiar faces of her family, seeing traces of Frank in each of them. Michael had his father's strong jawline and quiet determination. Sarah shared Frank's gentle way with children and his ability to find hope in difficult situations. Even little Emma had inherited his patient smile. Around 9 o'clock, Emma grew restless. Jenny took her to the hospital cafeteria for breakfast, while Tommy tagged along in search of better Wi-Fi. The waiting room felt emptier without them, the silence heavier. "Remember when Dad taught us to ride bikes?" Michael asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "How he never used training wheels because he said we'd learn better without them?" Sarah laughed softly. "I was so scared, but he just kept running alongside, saying, 'I've got you, princess. I won't let go until you're ready.' And he never did," Michael added. "Even when we thought we were ready, he'd still be there, just in case." Eleanor's throat tightened. She remembered watching from the kitchen window as Frank spent hours in the driveway with their children, his patience never wavering. She'd been so focused on what she thought he wasn't doing that she'd missed seeing all that he was. The door opened, and Jenny returned with the kids and a bag of vending machine snacks. Emma immediately climbed onto Eleanor's lap, offering her a slightly squashed package of cookies. "For you, Grandma," she said solemnly. "Daddy says you forgot breakfast." Eleanor hugged her granddaughter close, breathing in the sweet smell of her strawberry shampoo. "Thank you, sweetheart." Time seemed to move differently in the waiting room, stretching and contracting like a rubber band. Eleanor found herself remembering moments she hadn't thought about in years. The way Frank had sung off-key lullabies to colicky babies, how he'd slip extra money into the children's lunch accounts without telling them, the time he'd driven through a snowstorm to bring Sarah her forgotten science project. At 10:30, a nurse came to tell them the surgery was progressing well. The relief in the room was palpable, but Eleanor couldn't relax. She wouldn't believe everything was okay until she saw Frank with her own eyes. Tommy had given up on his phone and was now teaching Emma how to make paper airplanes out of old magazines. The little girl's delighted giggles when one actually flew across the room brought smiles to everyone's faces. "Dad would love this," Sarah murmured to Eleanor. "He always said Tommy had a gift for teaching." Eleanor nodded, remembering how proud Frank had been when Tommy won the science fair last year. He'd shown up early to help set up the display, even though Eleanor had made it clear she didn't want him there. Now she wondered how many other moments of joy she'd tainted with her anger. The clock ticked past 11. Emma had fallen asleep again, this time sprawled across several chairs with her head in Tommy's lap. Michael had resumed his pacing, though more slowly now. Sarah and Jenny whispered together in the corner, probably making plans for Frank's recovery. Eleanor closed her eyes, offering up a silent prayer. not just for Frank's recovery, but for the chance to make things right. To show him that she finally understood the depth of his character, the quiet strength that had supported their family even when she'd pushed him away. At 11:45, the door opened. Everyone straightened as a tired-looking surgeon appeared, still wearing his scrub cap. Eleanor's heart seemed to stop as she searched his face for any sign of bad news. Then he smiled, and the whole room seemed to brighten. "The surgery was successful," he announced. "Mr. Walker came through like a champion. His heart is responding well to the procedure." A collective breath of relief filled the room. Sarah burst into tears, hugging Jenny tightly. Michael sat down heavily, his face in his hands. Tommy gently woke Emma to tell her the good news, and the little girl's sleepy, "Yay, Grandpa," made everyone laugh through their tears. Eleanor remained seated, her legs too shaky to stand. The surgeon's words echoed in her head. Successful, champion, responding well. Frank was going to be okay. They had more time. Time to heal, to rebuild, to create new memories untainted by bitterness. She looked around at her family, their family, and saw Frank's legacy in every smile, every tear of joy, every tight hug. He had built this, quietly and steadily, even while she had tried to tear it down. His heart, which had given so much to others, would continue beating. The thought filled her with gratitude so profound it took her breath away. The afternoon sun filtered through the half-drawn blinds of Frank's hospital room, creating strips of golden light across the sterile white sheets. Eleanor paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of him. He looked smaller somehow, propped up against the pillows with monitoring wires snaking from beneath his hospital gown. But his eyes were clear and alert as they met hers. "Come in," Frank said softly, his voice a bit raspy. "The chair's not too uncomfortable." Eleanor moved to sit beside his bed, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the silence between them. On the windowsill, Get Well cards stood like colorful sentinels, testament to the community's outpouring of support. "How are you feeling?" she asked, noting the slight pallor of his face. "Better each day. Doctor says I'm healing well." Frank adjusted himself slightly, wincing. "Though I wish they'd ease up on the bland diet." A small smile tugged at Eleanor's lips. "You always did hate hospital food." "Some things never change," he agreed, then fell quiet, his eyes studying her face. "Eleanor, you didn't have to organize all this. The fundraiser, the cards, everything." "Yes, I did." She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Frank, I've been so wrong. For years, I've been so terribly wrong about you." He shook his head slightly. "You had your reasons." "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't. I was bitter and hurt, and I chose to see only what fed that bitterness. While you were quietly helping everyone, including my own mother, I was wishing you—" She broke off, unable to repeat those cruel words from the restaurant. "That's past now," Frank said gently. "But how can it be? How can you just forgive like that?" Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "All these years, you've been taking care of everyone. My mother, our son's college expenses, even my mortgage that time. You never said a word, never asked for recognition or thanks." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on top of the blanket. "When we divorced," he finally said, "it didn't change who I was, who we all were to each other. Family isn't just about marriage papers." Eleanor wiped at her eyes. "But I made it so hard. I was so angry." "You were hurting," Frank replied simply. "We both were, just in different ways. I couldn't fix our marriage, but I could still help in other ways. It felt right." The simplicity of his answer made Eleanor's heart ache. She thought of all the times she'd questioned his character, his commitment, his love. Yet here was the truth. Love expressed not in grand gestures or words, but in quiet acts of service year after year. "I've been thinking about what happened at Sarah's birthday dinner," Eleanor admitted. "About what I said. I can't take those words back, but I want you to know how deeply I regret them." Frank's eyes softened. "I never held those words against you, Eleanor. Anger says things the heart doesn't mean." "But that's just it," she responded, her voice trembling. "You've shown such grace, such forgiveness. While I've been holding on to grudges, you've been holding up our whole family without anyone knowing." A nurse passed by the door, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor. In that brief pause, Eleanor gathered her courage. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she continued, "but I'm asking for it anyway. And I want you to know that I'm here now, really here. Not as your wife. That chapter is closed, but as someone who sees you for who you truly are and wants to support you the way you've supported everyone else." Frank's eyes grew misty. "Eleanor, you've had my forgiveness for years. You just didn't know to ask for it." She reached for his hand then, surprising them both. His skin was warm and familiar, marked with the calluses of a man who'd worked hard all his life, who'd given much and asked for little. "Let me walk this new chapter with you," Eleanor said softly. "Not as your wife, but as your friend, your ally, someone who finally understands the kind of man you are." Frank's fingers tightened around hers, and in that gentle pressure, Eleanor felt decades of unspoken words, of quiet devotion, of love that had transformed rather than died. It wasn't romantic love anymore, but something deeper, a connection, forged through years of shared history and newly discovered truth. "I'd like that," Frank whispered, and Eleanor squeezed his hand in response, sealing their new beginning with that simple touch. The afternoon sun had shifted, the strips of light now falling across their joined hands. In the peaceful quiet of the hospital room, surrounded by the evidence of community love and support, two people who had once lost their way found a new path forward, not back to what was, but toward something different and precious in its own right. Eleanor squeezed his hand once more, a promise in the gesture. Whatever came next, they would face it not as former spouses, bitter with regret, but as allies bound by understanding and grace. The September breeze rustled through the maple trees, scattering golden leaves across the park's grassy expanse. Eleanor spread a checkered blanket beneath the shade of an old oak tree, smoothing out the wrinkles with practiced care. Around her, the joyful chaos of family life unfolded. Her grandchildren darted between the trees, their laughter carrying across the park. 6-year-old Tommy chased his older sister Sarah with a toy airplane, while their cousin Emily gathered acorns in the folds of her yellow sundress. The sight warmed Eleanor's heart in a way she hadn't felt in years. Frank sat in a folding chair nearby, his recovery evident in the healthy color that had returned to his cheeks. He was showing their youngest grandson how to build a paper airplane, his weathered hands moving with gentle patience as the little boy watched in wonder. The surgery scar peeked out from his collar, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing him. Eleanor's mother, looking stronger than she had in months, rested on a cushioned lawn chair under a nearby umbrella. She beamed at the scene before her, occasionally calling out to the children with offers of lemonade or cookies from the picnic basket. "Mom, let me help you with that," Eleanor's daughter Sarah called, hurrying over to arrange the paper plates and plastic utensils on the portable table. Her husband Tom followed with a covered dish of grilled chicken, the savory aroma drawing everyone closer. Eleanor watched as her son Michael, once so distant, settled beside Frank with his own little boy. The two men talked quietly, their faces open and relaxed in a way that would have seemed impossible just months ago. The bitter divide that had split their family was healing, day by day, moment by moment. "Who wants potato salad?" Eleanor called out, lifting the container from the cooler. A chorus of "me" rang out as family members gathered around the blanket, creating a circle of love and connection that had been missing for too long. Frank caught her eye and smiled, that same gentle smile she'd once taken for granted. "Save some for your mother," he reminded everyone, already preparing a plate with all her favorite items. Eleanor watched as he carried it to her mother, making sure she was comfortable before returning to the group. The afternoon unfolded like a cherished photograph coming to life. The children played tag between bites of food, their energy seemingly endless. Stories and laughter flowed freely, old memories mixing with new ones being made. Even the mistakes of the past seemed softer now, worn smooth by time and understanding like river stones. "Remember when Tommy tried to catch that squirrel last summer?" Sarah laughed, ruffling her son's hair. "Dad, you were the only one who could calm him down when it ran up that tree." Frank chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, some things just take patience," he said, winking at Tommy. "Like waiting for the right moment to share your sandwich with the birds instead." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion as she watched 3 generations of her family share this peaceful moment. The bitterness that had once consumed her thoughts seemed like a distant shadow now, replaced by a profound gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. Her mother caught her gaze and patted the space beside her chair. Eleanor moved over, taking her mother's frail hand in hers. "Look at what love can do," her mother whispered, gesturing to the scene before them. "All it takes is an open heart." The afternoon light began to soften, painting everything in warm amber tones. The children's games grew quieter, more subdued, as the day's activities caught up with them. Little Emily curled up in Frank's lap, her eyes heavy with sleep, while Tommy and Sarah sprawled on the blanket, pointing out shapes in the clouds above. Michael's wife Jessica began packing away the leftovers, humming softly as she worked. The simple domestic task seemed to encompass everything that had changed: the healing of old wounds, the rebuilding of trust, the power of forgiveness freely given and gratefully received. Eleanor watched as Frank gently transferred the sleeping Emily to her mother's arms. His movements were careful, protective, the same way he'd always cared for those around him, even when she'd been too angry to see it. The man she had once wished gone had never truly left. He'd simply continued loving them all in his quiet, steadfast way. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The family gathered their belongings, moving with the unhurried contentment of people who know they'll see each other again soon. Frank helped Eleanor's mother to her feet, supporting her with the same tenderness he'd shown all these years. The sight no longer filled Eleanor with confusion or guilt, but with a deep appreciation for the man who had never stopped being family, even when she'd pushed him away. Standing at the edge of the park, watching her loved ones head to their cars with waves and calls of, "See you Sunday," Eleanor felt the weight of her past bitterness finally lift completely. The anger that had once defined her relationship with Frank had transformed into something she never expected, a friendship built on understanding, respect, and the kind of love that survives even after romance ends. As the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold, Eleanor looked at Frank helping her mother into her daughter's car. The moment crystallized her transformation, and she found herself whispering the truth that had been growing in her heart. "I once wished him gone. Now, I thank God he stayed." What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Eleanor, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.